Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming for today's seminar. It's great pleasure that we have Case, our SPRI alumni, come today for the seminar. Case is the co-founder and CEO of the PV Lighthouse, a company that works on the PV software for the software for the PV industry. Case completed his PhD in UNSW before he worked in ANU and SunSolve Power and PV Lighthouse. So the PV Lighthouse is working on like softwares, do simulation and characterization of the solar cells and solar farm systems. So Case has published more than 150 scientific papers. And today he will talk about the launch of the SunSolve new software. Right. I think there's a lot of users from SPRI of the software, so look forward to your talk. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Colin. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for everyone watching online. Hello. So yes, Keith McIntosh from PV Lighthouse, and I'm talking to you today about SunSolve. So SunSolve is a program that you now all have free access to. In fact, at UNSW, you've had it free access for quite some time, but it's now available for all ACAP members. And in this talk, I'll describe why that is, how that came to pass, roughly what SunSolve does and how it works, and what research opportunities that lends to us all here at SPRI. So I'll begin by describing an arena project that we were recently awarded. The purpose of the project is to help determine the energy that's generated by a system such as this. So large scale utility plant. And there's a lot of value for predicting how much energy will come out of this in the future, whether it's over sort of the term of its life, decades, or even just at a particular point in time, early in the morning or in the afternoon or on cloudy days. There's a value to being able to predict that accurately. And one of the big ones is to, if one can say how much power it'll produce over time, that gives us an idea of how much revenue that it'll bring in, and that gives us an idea of how much the project should be lent money and how how confident that the lenders and the investors are in the return on their investment. And that's a big deal for solar. So at the moment in Australia, about 50% of the cost of a project, that is the design, the development of it, the running of it, is in the cost of financing. So think of that as the interest rate. So for so long it was the modules that were an expensive part of the system. And the work done here at UNSW and the ACAP members and all around the world has meant that those cost of the modules has declined a lot. And now they only make a smallish fraction of the cost of one of these projects. What can we do about it? Well, if we're more accurate with our predictions of how much power will be produced, that will give more confidence to the lenders in the return of investment. And that tends to mean a less risky project, and which works its way through to better terms of borrowing, interest rates, or the fraction that might be loaned to do a project. And so there's a lot of effort goes into forecasting the yield. So the energy yield that will come from a large-scale PV project. And these calculations are made very early on during the prospecting stage. They're made during the development and the design. They're made for qualifying whether the project meets its expectation, and then during operation. And there's some standard approaches that are taken in the industry to calculate how much yield there'll be. So yeah, we can't predict how much energy will be produced next year that accurately because we don't know what the weather will be. And so there's some level of uncertainty around the weather that is unavoidable. But there's other sources of uncertainty too. So how will the project be operating? How often it will be cleaned? How often the inverters will be available? What the curtailment will be? That is, whether the grid just shuts the project off. So there's all these levels of uncertainty that are difficult to predict. And then there's some that we can actually quantify more readily. And they're the ones that's called the model uncertainty. So the model is, well, if we know what the sunlight's coming in, how do we convert that optics into the amount of power being generated by the cells? If we understand the thermal behaviour and the electrical behaviour of the modules and the strings and the project, how can we predict the amount of power that's going to coming out. And the better the model, the more accurate we are. And the more accurate we are, well, if you look at this probability distribution, then the thinner that the thinner that Gaussian curve. So a typical forecast assumes that the uncertainty is Gaussian, or bell curve like that. And that's a very simple approximation, but it's what the industry has been doing for decades. In reality, we think it looks much more like this. So there's three main things that differ. And part of our ACAP project is to make these calculations more accurately and to understand exactly what the shape is of what you would call a correct forecast. I'll just use the term correct here, being that if we really did understand the uncertainties and we could predict them well, then what would this probability curve distribution look like? So the first thing you'll notice is that a typical forecast overestimates the yield, and that's sort of commonly appreciated in the industry, and of course people are doing things about that, but it's sort of widely accepted that the energy that's being generated by power plants is smaller than what is being predicted earlier in their design. The second thing is that distribution for the correct one in the dark curve is much wider. In other words, the uncertainty is higher than what's being forecast for a typical project. And the final thing is that it's asymmetric. So the downside behaviour has a longer tail than the upside. And lenders are more interested in the downside because they're being conservative. They want to make sure that they get their money back. But if you're operating the plant, you're interested in the good years as much as you're interested in the bad years. So knowing that the probability isn't Gaussian, that it's asymmetric, has value. So yeah, part of our ACAP project is to calculate that more accurately, to use the best forms and procedures and algorithms to calculate it. But the major part is to improve on it. So once we're calculating it correctly, is then to reduce the uncertainty through developing better models, and that we do that through SunSolve. So our ARENA project that was awarded, and thanks ARENA for that, is called the Accurate and Precise Solar Yield Modelling with SunSolve. And we're developing and validating algorithms, procedures and software to lead to improved forecasts for the energy yield from power plants. It's a 3-year project that began very recently, and it's a $4 million project where we received $2 million of funding from ARENA, and we have $2 million of in-kind support, contribution from ourselves. And part of that is to provide SunSolve to all ACAP members over the term of the project. So a brief bit about us at PV Lighthouse. We're an Australian company and we provide R&D software for the PV industry. There's 3 of us at present. That's me and Malcolm, who many of you will know. So Mal and I both did our PhDs here, headed off to America and worked in startups, or equivalent to startups, in the industry. Returned to Australia and I worked at the ANU and Mal was at UNSW. And then we formed PV Lighthouse. And with a third member called Ben Sudbury, who most of you won't be aware of unless you've had any communications with us about SunSolve. And then you'll know that he's a computer IT genius and a business development guru. So the 3 of us together have worked on PV Lighthouse for many years. And now we're thrilled to be able to double the size of our company with the ARENA funding. So we'll be employing 3 to 4 people, both coders and researchers, to help us work on the project. So historically, we started the website in 2011 and founded the company soon afterwards. Most of our income at that point came through consulting, and even though we were generating software, it was all free, and the money, well, the interest that we had over the software helped bring in consulting projects. But that turned soon into SunSolve Power. And the great advantage that had, and the reason that we could sell it as subscription software, was it had a ray tracing engine that was not available to the PV community. So that enabled people to do ray tracing ray tracing simulations on cells and modules. And then we had a lot of interest from the US from the systems people who said, could you extend that to do the ray tracing for a system? We've got bifacial modules. We don't know how much power that the bifacial illumination is providing, and we need to know it in order to to design our systems better. And so we received funding there to extend the ray tracing on cells and modules into systems, which we then turned into a product, SunSolve Yield, just a few years ago. And that's led on to the ARENA grant more recently. And our focus over those years began primarily in solar cells, which is what Malcolm and I had most of our training in at UNSW. And we've gradually drifted downstream through modules into unit systems, which is like a small section of a large power plant, and now into power plants. So we still provide software that looks into solar cells, but the main focus of our research and development has drifted downstream into power plants. So now I'll move on to SunSolve. First mention that we've just released a new website, sunsolve.info, which will have a lot of info, and that's dedicated just to SunSolve. So our PV Lighthouse page that's got all the free software is still existing, and we'll maintain that, but we'll be putting all the new information about SunSolve here. And there's two products, I mentioned them both, SunSolve Power and SunSolve Yield. So SunSolve Power is being used by the cell and the module manufacturers. And last year, the subscribers to SunSolve Power shipped 50% of all the modules shipped in the world. So it's widely used by the industry. And in fact, 4 of the top 5, the 5 biggest module manufacturers are all subscribers to SunSolve Power. And then there's a lot of academic institutes that use it too, as UNSW and the ANU have done in Australia almost since its conception. And where there's been about 100 papers that have been published by those academics that use SunSolve Power. SunSolve Yield, on the other hand, is mainly used by the system developers and also by tracking companies, by the independent engineering firms. They're usually the firms that are tasked with doing those yield forecasts. And then also module manufacturers are starting to take up SunSolve Yield. SunSolve Power solves the behaviour of wafers, cells, modules and basic unit systems, and it provides their behaviour, or it examines their behaviour at just one point in time. And people often use it to determine the losses, which it gives for every single component at all wavelengths. SunSolve Yield is used to look at really the detailed behaviour of systems, and usually for utility scale projects. The output energy, it determines the output energy rather than the power. So it's the energy yield, that's why we use the term yield. And it's usually run for a period of time like 1 year, but you can use it for any period. Short periods like half a day or a month, or we're moving towards like 30-year simulations as well. And it's determining the major losses versus time. So we're not providing the outputs of the losses in every single component of the cells or the modules at all wavelengths. That would be too much information for anybody to cope with, or for the service to cope with. So we're giving the major losses from a system over time. Now I'll talk about SunSolve Power and its methodology that underlies it. So we want to take a cell or a module and predict how much power it will produce. And so we begin by defining its dimensions and its materials and the optical properties of all of its materials. And then, as I mentioned, its major advance is the ray tracing engine, which is all run in the cloud and is done with I think we've got 200 parallel computers for all of the subscribers. So that speeds up the ray tracing and makes it, I think most solutions within 5 or 10 seconds. And that gives the absorption in every material. And we combine that with collection efficiencies and spectra to give the current that's being absorbed or reflected from the module. In parallel, we do analytical equations to determine the series resistance in each component of the grid and the cell, and then we combine that with equivalent circuit inputs in a SPICE model to give the IV curve. So it's a relatively simple flow, and the majority of the power is in the ray tracing, and the majority of the advantage of using SunSolve. And so, in short, it's the optics that are very complicated for a module, but that can be solved rapidly with SunSolve Power. It can solve all sort of major cell structures, and the outputs that it gives, I've mentioned a few, the absorption, reflection, transmission, but also gives the QE, mismatch losses, and the generation profiles, with a lot of researchers use, and they feed in the generation profiles that they determine from SunSolve into programs like Quokka and DESIS to further sort of do more analysis on the semiconductor behaviour of the cells. I'll speed things along and not read everything out, but it can solve it accounts for all the features of a modern module. A few examples. Our most recent favourite one is a loss analysis that was done by Longi and published in Nature, which showed, examined the world record silicon heterojunction cell that they produced a couple of years ago. So it was 26.7% cell, and their comparison to the experimental data you can see on the right between the simulation and the measurements at ISFH were very close. And that gave them a lot of confidence in the simulation, which meant that they trusted its loss analysis. So they broke down the behaviour of their cell and its measurement all the way down to how much light was being absorbed in the test chuck behind the solar cell. And once they understand the cell this well, then they can do sensitivity analyses and evaluate and figure out what would they want to do next to improve the efficiency further. Or for many cell companies, what they could do, that they might introduce a simpler and cheaper approach that may lend itself to a lower efficiency but still be worth their while. And so SunSolve is often used by the module manufacturers for that purpose. There was another recent study by KAUST, by Lu Jieju, who looked at the optical behaviour of perovskite silicon tandems. So you can see in the SEM image that they deposited their perovskite on top of a random pyramid, but it's not perfectly conformal. So there's texture on top of texture. And SunSolve's capable of simulating that, and they ended up getting a better fit to their experimental data when they incorporated the TOT, that's texture on texture. So tandems are pretty interesting at present, and Bram and Phil's recent project with ARENA had provided funding for us to expand the SunSolve Power to solve the electrical behaviour of tandems. It had previously been able to handle the optical, but we've now improved it so that it can provide the EQE of both the front or the top and the bottom cells. And in fact, it works for any multi-junction with any number of junctions. So the value of that, once you've got, again, a good fit between simulation and experiment, and you trust your simulation, that offers you the opportunity to learn things, to redesign your cells, and to make improvements, or to figure out how this cell would behave under different circumstances, like if the incident angle were changed, or if the spectra were changed, or if the temperature were changed. Things like that can be fed in order to help you understand how the solar cell will behave in practice. The final example for SunSolve Power is a CTM analysis. So Ingrid Hedrick at Fraunhofer developed this procedure many years ago, and we think it's a good one. And so we've got a procedure where you can do multiple SunSolve simulations in order to calculate the losses and the gains that occur when you encapsulate a solar cell. And you can see on the left, that's for efficiency changes, on the right, for power. So they're quite different and well worth understanding in order to try to minimise those losses as you encapsulate cells into modules. I'll run through a couple more applications of it. I've mentioned a few: optimisation and loss analysis, CTM. The one I like the most, in fact, is when you run an experiment, no matter what it is, spectrophotometry measurements, what I used to do a lot at the ANU, is to run a simulation in parallel with that. So I sort of had a policy or a suggestion with my students, which was never do an experiment without a simulation. It's when you do the two together that you understand the most. And so, things like ensuring that you have a good calibration of your experimental equipment is much easier once you're running simulation in parallel. I'll move on now to SunSolve Yield. So the methodology behind SunSolve Yield is more complicated. In the first point, we're solving the behaviour of a system at a single point first, but then we integrate over a period. And the most common period is, hi Renata, welcome. The most common period is a year, and with 1 hourly intervals. And so simulating a year amounts to normally about 4,500 simulations. And so once again, we do this in parallel, and we turn up the knobs a bit and tend to use 600. I think we've gone up to 2,000 cores. That's computers solving this in the cloud to speed it up. And a quick simulation like that, or a simple simulation, would normally take about a minute to solve. So that's running all the ray tracing that represents a year of behaviour for a system. But what underneath lies that is much more complicated, and that's because this system's operating in the field. And so we take into account the position of the sun in the sky, we take into account the spectrum, we take into account the sky illumination distribution. I won't go through all the details here, but you get the picture that there's a lot more complicated than it is to simulate something under SDC conditions. So the system's operating not at 25 degrees Celsius like at STC, but at some temperature that needs to be calculated depending on the temperature and the wind speed and its angle of incidence and so on. So underlying SunSolve Yield is a much more complicated and intense procedure. And I mentioned before for SunSolve Power we're dominated by the ray tracing. But in SunSolve Power there's a lot of electrical solving, which I'll mention a bit more soon, that needs to be solved. So we string up every cell, we string up every module, we put them into strings, and all of that is being solved in a SPICE solver in order to get an accurate representation of the module and the string's electrical behaviour in the field. So the capabilities, we can locate a system anywhere in the world and expose it to any type of weather. We also go beyond what is normally done and include the atmospheric conditions. And so things like the precipitable water vapour and the ozone, they affect the spectrum. And you can get that from weather supplying companies, and that's included in the inputs, and we generate the spectra at every point, and then that helps us solve the system more accurately. We can solve tracking and fixed and waves, like the 5B's Maverick. And we can put in a module like the one that we developed under SunSolve Power, where we define every aspect of it, its material dimensions and the texture and the films, and all of that can be included in SunSolve Yield so that you can figure out how a module that you've developed in the lab will behave once it's installed outdoors. But that's overkill for a lot of companies. So a lot of the developers, they don't need to know exactly the ray tracing up inside the cell. In fact, they wouldn't even have the material properties. And it's about 10 times faster to ray trace just to the module instead. And so we have both those complicated modules and simple modules that are used to speed things on. You can change all of the layout of the system, module heights and pitches, stringing, all that sort of stuff. Modify the albedo. The structural supports is a really interesting aspect, especially for bifacial simulations. And more recently, we've made it so that you can load a CAD file, and I'll give a demonstration of that in a moment. So a CAD file of all the structural supports that might be in a system, and they'll be ray traced at almost it doesn't take much longer to solve than if you load sort of generic structures. And it can do a bunch of other things. So let me give you some results and some demonstrations of how it's been used. So we did a project with FTC Solar, that's a US tracking company, and they had pyranometers installed on the front and the rear sides of their tracking systems. And one of the objectives was to see, could we simulate the behaviour of the pyranometers? And we could do that. You can see the example here for the front side, which isn't too much of a challenge. But the big challenge is the light that's landing on the rear surface of the modules and onto the rear pyranometers. So the optics of that situation is much more complicated because the light's reflecting off the ground and being impinged by different structural supports. So the thing that we learned when we looked at the experimental data was that there was a lot of structure in the rear illumination. You can see that structure in the curve. And when we first ran the simulation, we didn't get anything like the same level of complexity. But it was through the simulation and through modifying things in that we could end up understanding the sources of that variation. So one of them was that light was reflecting off the front of the panels of a neighbouring row and bouncing onto the rear surface of the other modules. And normally that's quite small, but in this experimental setup, the modules at one side were multicrystalline, more reflecting wafers, and so that's what led to the shoulders in the curve. Another thing that happened was that the tracking algorithm that was used was more conservative than ideal, which we learn is common, of course, because when you do a tracking, you want it to face the sun, but as it gets late in the day, you don't want to have the sun being shaded from one module onto another, and so they use backtracking. But the backtracking algorithms are more conservative because they want to be sure that they don't have any shading. And so that leads to sunlight passing in between modules and the rows and landing on the ground and reflecting, and that led to these curious structures or effects, these bumps, late and early in the day. And so the value of that to the yield is very small. You know, it didn't make very much difference. But what was important was it was a great validation of the ray tracing. And once again, if you've done something well enough through the simulation that you trust it, it gives you this great power to be able to test all these different conditions that you can't test experimentally, especially when you're running systems. It's not like cells where you might make 30 different cells and test how they all operate. You can't make 30 different systems and do that. So another thing we looked at in the same study with FTC was the module temperature. So there were thermocouples attached to the rear surface of these modules. And then we ran the standard temperature model that's used in a standard yield forecast, and we compared the predicted temperature to the measured temperature. And the predicted one was, on average, about 3 degrees higher, which is a lot. So 3 degrees higher silicon modules means you're losing 1% yield, or the 1%, you're underestimating the yield by 1% if you over-predict its temperature by 3 degrees. But also you'll notice there's a lot of scatter. In other words, there wasn't much confidence, or there's a great amount of uncertainty in the standard model. So we expanded the model and included that in SunSolve. And you can see that it now fits perfectly, but you expect that. If we're going to train a model on that data set, it's going to fit the data. So more important than that is the reduction in the uncertainty. And you can see that the scatter is a lot less, although it doesn't quite really capture how much less. So it went from about plus or minus 4.5 degrees to plus or minus 1.5 degrees as the 95% confidence interval. So that's about a 3 times improvement in the accuracy, or the 3% reduction, 3 times reduction in uncertainty. And that takes us back to, the goal of our ACAP project is continually doing things like this to increase the confidence that we can predict the behaviour of systems. Another cool shot we like to show is one of the outputs that you have from SunSolve Yield, which is an intensity map of a system. In fact, it's not really an intensity map, it's a current map. So it's the current that's being generated by each of the cells. And in this unit system, so the unit system is like some section of the field that's going to be repeated in both directions. I think there might be 21 modules here. Each of those has 144 solar cells. And so the ray tracing computes the light that's being generated or is being absorbed by each of those solar cells, the many thousands of them, at every point throughout the year. So there's 4,500 data points throughout the year, and we're calculating the current in each of these cells. So it gives you some idea of the computing power that's going into solving this. But what we learned from it, more importantly, is it's the variability of the light on the rear surface of the modules. And this was the main reason we were first tasked back in 2018 to extend our ray tracing, was because this is something that's very difficult to measure. I think I've really only seen 1 or 2 papers that have looked at what's the uncertainty, what's the variability in illumination on the rear surface of a module, which is changing all the time throughout the day and depending on the weather conditions. And so we can map that so easily with the simulation, and you can see around the edges of each module we have less light. I should point out, red means more higher current and blue means lower current. And so around the edges of the rear surface, the frame wraps around and shades some of the edge cells. And then you can see that the torque tube is shading the middle part of the module. And you can see that at one end there's more light that's being received by the edge modules. That's called edge brightening, because light's passing in between the gaps between the module bays. And most obviously you can see there's this gradient across the module. So under direct light, or let's say on sunny days, more light reflects off the ground onto the lower part of the module than reflects onto the top part. And on cloudy days, the opposite's true. More light lands on the upper part of the module than the lower part. So being able to ray trace this, really gives you sort of a great visual help and understanding of what's happening. And we can also then use that to quantify how much of a loss that non-uniformity introduces to the system. One other point I meant to point out was you can see this gear that's controlling the tracker. So that's included that was loaded from a CAD file. And the ray tracing of that, you can see that these central modules receive slightly less light. And so the companies that are interested in this, they want to see what effect that adding a gear will make to their systems, or running wires across the back, or adding some other structural thing that's within the system, like an inverter box. So one other map like that we did recently was to simulate the 5B Mavericks system. So in this case, the module bay is just 5 modules long, and this is like the repeating thing. There's an east-facing and a west-facing module in the Mavericks. And under direct irradiance, there's a different amount of intensity that falls on the east and west facing because they have different, or the light impinges on them with different incident angles. And so we have less light landing on the west than on the east in this example. Under diffuse light, it's roughly uniform. It looks like scatter, but that's just stochastic error from the ray tracing, and it's very small scatter. So on the front, we don't need ray tracing to compute that. Simple view factor will do that accurately enough. But how much light gets onto the rear of a Maverick, and what advantage might that be if you use bifacial modules compared to monofacial? So we run that ray tracing, and you can see here that there's more light under direct light getting to the edge modules. If this was in the southern hemisphere, this would be the northern side. So more light gets in between the modules, bounces off the ground, but only gets onto this edge of the system. Whereas the diffuse light is coming in from all angles, it bounces off the ground and gets up onto both the northern and the southern edges. So if we combine the front and the rear, because of course there's way less light getting onto the rear, you can see that there still is a difference, that these edge modules are receiving extra light. Now there's a rule of thumb that says that if you have a string of modules, that you're limited by your worst one. The one that's generating the least current limits the entire string. And so you would say, well, they might be getting extra light, and I'll let you know already, they got about 2% bifacial gain. So they got the extra light, but do they lose it all because they're limited by the central modules, which don't have any advantage? They're not getting any light landing on them from the rear. And so if you trusted that rule of thumb, you'd say there's no point using any bifacial modules in a Maverick. And I have to admit, that was what I suggested to 5B when they first said, is it worth us looking at bifacial modules? But in SunSolve Yield, we have the behaviour of the current going into every cell, and we string all of those cells up into a SPICE model. So the cells are combined with bypass diodes. They're all combined into a string, and then we compute the electronics of that string. So just look at the right-hand column, and you'll see if you add up those two numbers, 1.75 and 0.25, that's the 2% bifacial gain. And the amount that we lose due to mismatch is only 0.25%. So the rule of thumbs in this situation is a terrible one. The rule of thumb would have been better, saying you'll get all of it rather than none of it. And you wouldn't really know that, I don't think, without running a decent simulation or a complicated experiment. So why is that? Just briefly, because your voltages of each of the module, they adjust, and you're not just limited by your lowest current. So if I move on now to another purpose that SunSolve Yield gets used for, and that is to determine factors for PVSyst. So PVSyst is the standard model the standard program that's used to predict the yield that's coming from a system. So those yield forecasts basically every one of them is using PVSyst. And so it's been around for decades. It's the status quo. It's just widely used all the way through the value chain. It's been used for when they're doing their prospecting, when they're doing their developing, when they're designing their systems, when they're operating them, they use this same program. So it's widely used, and while we'd like them to use our software instead, we also recognise that using the two in tandem can be very useful. And one of the things that PVSyst does is it takes a very simple optical approach. And so it's like solving the ideal situation. And then they say, well, it's not ideal, so we have to have some factors to adjust for that, some fudge factors. And one factor is they have a partial transparency factor to account for the extra light that passes between modules. And another one is there's a structural shading factor. So whereas in SunSolve Yield, we put in the dimensions and the layout and it solves it for you, in PVSyst and a lot of programs similar to that, you have to know how much extra light is landing on the rear, or less light landing on the rear due to these different physical effects. And so these are like inputs that are required for PVSyst. And in SunSolve Yield, you can run that to determine the inputs for these programs like PVSyst. Now those values that are required are usually annual average values, just a single value to represent structural shading. And it's interesting, so these graphs on the right, if I take structural shading, that's the purple one, you can see that there is an annual value that can be calculated, that's the line, to represent structural shading. But actually there's a lot of seasonal dependence. So each of those dots is what the daily average would be. And there's a lot of dependence on the weather conditions. So the cloudier the light, the cloudier the day, the structural shading effectively, what's this one? Yeah, decreases as the light gets that's more. So the purpose is to show that if you do things to a greater level of accuracy, you're capturing these variabilities that's occurring due to seasonal and weather dependence. Final example is some work done at ASU, and they had a look at what's the optimal ARC coding on a module. So ARCs are being optimised for STC conditions to ensure that the modules are as most efficient as they can be under test. That way they can sell them for more. But once they're installed in the field, what's the actual optimal ARC? The light's coming in at many different angles. It's not just normally incident. There's different spectra occurring at all times throughout the year, and the modules are tracking or fixed. And so what they found was that the optimal ARC thickness is about 20 or 30 nanometers thicker than for STC, and that lends to an increase yield of about 0.3%. So SunSolve Yield then gave them the opportunity to optimise their module for a real-world condition rather than STC. So the main applications, annual yield, testing new structural component designs, quantifying aspects of the system, sensitivity analyses, determining PVSyst factors, optimising modules for the real world, and education. I should have mentioned education for SunSolve Power too, because Bram's designed a course on manufacturing that uses SunSolve Power to do simulations. So now that SunSolve Yield is available for all of the ACAP institutes, you might like to think of ways that it can be used to further education and to help with courses. So I'll finish up with a few ideas for research opportunities that SunSolve gives. Mention that you do have 3-year subscriptions to both of those programs for all the ACAP partners, but also to be clear that there is a restriction, and that is that you can't just send off the results that you're getting from SunSolve to anyone, run a consulting project on the side. So we still have to make a business and sell our products to potential companies that would want to use it. But you can anything that you publicise, you can make available to any company or to a company that is already a subscriber. So we're happy for that. We'll also mention that we always take feedback, of course, on bugs. We'd like to fix any bugs that arise, but also we work with all of our subscribers, and we give advice. Whenever you see discrepancies between experiment and simulation, we've got a lot of experience to help understand the sources of those discrepancies. And we're always happy to give feedback on papers or anything else that you'd like to publicise. So tandems is one of the big ones. I know there's many people here working in tandems. It's included in SunSolve Power. So it solves the optics, it solves the electronics, but it's not in SunSolve Yield, so it can't at present be, you can't run a simulation in Yield, but it is something that is a part of our ACAP project that we're introducing. But I did mention right earlier on that SunSolve Power does have the capacity to solve a system at a single point in time. So you could be checking out things like spectral mismatch or just mismatch between the upper and the lower parts of a perovskite tandem already. Degradation. Torsten and co, we were just talking about what a big deal this is, how often degradation is swept under the carpet. A standard yield forecast assumes that it's a linear and at some rate, when in reality, of course, it's not linear and it varies throughout a site. It depends on the weather, it depends on how the system is being operated. So we'll be very curious to learn of any insights or any experiments that you're running or any models that you develop that we could insert into SunSolve Yield to have a more accurate approach to degradation and yield forecasts. Cloudy sky spectra is another really big issue that's undervalued, I think. So here's some work from Ben Duck and Chris Fell at CSIRO, which shows the spectral correction factor. So all yield forecasts, apart from ours, assume that the AM 1.5G spectrum just always exists. Whether it's direct light or diffuse light, it's the same spectrum at all times. Whereas we're calculating the spectrum and as it varies throughout the day and year. So they did measurements and they found that the spectral correction, the number that you would multiply your yield forecast by to account for the real spectrum, has this seasonal dependence. And there's loads of experiments that show that seasonal dependence, that in the winter a system operates sometimes better than AM 1.5G, in the summer it's worse. But when it's cloudy, that's all these scattered points. When it's cloudy, the spectrum changes such that we're always underestimating the yield. The cloudier it is, the more we underestimate it. And that's because, simply put, the spectra becomes bluer, but it's more complicated than that in reality. And so the only models to account for cloudy sky conditions at the moment are either way too simple or designed for a single location, or they're extremely complicated and take too long to solve. So we'll be very happy to work with anyone in cloudy sky spectra research. I won't go into that now because I'm running out of time, but this gives you an idea of how important it is for yield forecasts. And there's so much to learn in thermal. So Bram's group, again, we were working in this and have been in improving thermal models from a simple Feynman approach, which is the standard, which has common inputs which are inaccurate to begin with, to making it more complicated. There's always value for simplicity. It's much easier to determine. So what's the optimum level of simplicity versus complexity and accuracy? What's the best trade-off? There's a lot to be learnt there. And once it's found, what are the inputs that best represent a Maverick or a tracker or a fixed system or anything else? And my final slide, second last, is just to give you an idea of a methodology approach, one that we take and we advise, and that is to break down things into sources of uncertainty. So here, this is the results that we did for a system, just the DC response from a module. And we broke it down into all these different ways in which SunSolve Yield or advanced models are different to a conventional model. So we looked at improvements in the spectral albedo model and the cell-to-cell mismatch, all the way up to system optics, which is ray tracing instead of view factor. And then we looked at the difference between them. And so this graph on the right is showing you the root mean square error. So just how varied the advanced model is compared to a conventional model. And once we can see that, then we can see which ones lend itself, or which ones are better to do more research on. Because anything with a greater level of uncertainty, then us as academics have the greatest to offer. So in reducing the uncertainty in the system optics by introducing ray tracing was the way we found we could most contribute towards reducing the uncertainty in system forecasts. And the next best one was the solar spectrum. So that's what we've worked on this year. We've also worked on the thermal ones. So in having a look at all the different models and how they interrelate and comparing them, the advanced ones, how they might be improved compared to experimental things, all that sort of stuff, breaking that down early in your project is really useful to help guide you to work on the lowest lying fruit. So yeah, I won't go through all the other ideas, but comparison to experiment is the area in system research I think that has the most to offer. Then there's the expanding of the models and a whole bunch of other things that I'm sure you'll have your own ideas for. And with that, I'll say thanks for all your time. We look forward to working with you over the next 3 years to get any feedback that you have on SunSolve, how you think it can be improved, and how what models that you recommend that we include to make it better still and to help us get from this black curve to the red one. So yeah, thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Keith, for the nice talk.
Yeah.
A lot of information. Do we have a question for Keith from the audience?
Bill.
What's the timeline for the systems implementation in Yield? Because I could see the inverters weren't there yet. Do you know what the timeline for them is?
Yeah, they're in the back end. So Mal's got that all working. And there's some users that are, we call it our beta product. So they're using that now. Yep. I don't know when it'll be released to the public.
Yeah.
Great work, and just a question around, do you think combined spectral and angular dependence of ground reflection is a thing that leads to some of the uncertainty, and is there a plan to have that and even maybe a database of different grounds, or how do you see that?
Oh, from the albedo?
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
so
yeah.
just not just doing during ray tracing at different wavelength and having that non-uniform spectral spectral reflectance from the ground, a different wavelength, a different shape.
Yes, so certainly for the wavelength dependence. So grass is the best example. It's green because it absorbs all the wavelengths less than 700 and it reflects everything beyond 700. So that's going to be important for a tandem, knowing what light is actually landing on the rear surface of a system. But for silicon, I think it's definitely a measurable effect of the difference in the bifacial gain that you have of grass relative to concrete or relative to white gravel. Snow has the opposite effect. It's more reflective at shorter wavelengths than longer wavelengths.
Can we maybe have different cone of reflection, right? Like they have different.
Oh yeah, there's that too. Yeah, so you mean the angular?
So is that a possibility to implement that to see?
Yeah, we have that. That's already in there. So you can have different levels of Lambertian versus specular reflectance. So something like floating PV, that's a big deal. The reflectance of water is not very scattery. Welcome. Yeah.
Thanks, Keith. It seems like generally, from what I'm listening to you, we've been underestimating as opposed to overestimating PV production.
I give you examples of underestimating, but most of them are overestimating.
And so what do you feel on average, is it across the about even or?
Yeah. But it's very difficult to break that down at the moment because you really want to get the data off the projects. And a lot of the projects suffer from curtailment, in certain periods. So, and of course, if you're a lender, all of that curtailment makes a big difference. But if you're trying to improve your models, you have to find good experimental data of very large scale projects that you can trust, and you have to marry it up to the weather conditions. So we work with a couple of companies where they're installing or they have installed really good metrology close to operating systems. And that's part of our ACAP project, is to get a much better handle on the sources of error for system-wide behaviour.
Thank
Thanks for a great talk. So I assume that at the moment you assume that your system operates the modules always at the maximum power point when the system is operational and not curtailed. Is that correct?
It's correct for the one for the public, yeah. We have control over that. So we can control the voltage at which the whole system's running at. So we're not operating it at maximum power, but that's an advance that isn't available yet.
Yeah, that is, I think, a suggestion that is extremely important, especially in Australia, where, as we discussed before, you have this up to 30% overbuild on the DC side. So the modules actually never actually run at MPP, at least not a large percentage of the year. So that would be nice to incorporate that in the model.
Yeah, very much so.
I have another question. On that slide where you showed the rear illumination and the variation across that string of modules, you had red and blue and white. What is sort of the relative difference between the top section and the bottom section in terms of absolute current?
Yeah, you can choose to control that in the software. In those examples, it was always max and min. So that range that I've got in the numbers, that's the max and min. So you can see it's, depends on whether you're looking at the front or the rear. On this, the Rex guide day, it was like half plus or minus, what's that, 5%?
Yeah, I was looking at the single tracking system.
Oh yeah, I didn't put the range on that. Well, that was just looking at the rear illumination, so that can be quite significant. It can vary by 50% across the rear side. But the amount of rear illumination is typically 5% gain. So, yeah, depends on what you're doing.
Any other question?
Yeah, look, I should mention I'm around all afternoon. So, after seeing the talk, you might have some questions of how you might like to use it, or you may already have questions from PV Lighthouse, simulation software, or other SunSolve Power.
Offer to stay here with us to discuss if you have any user question for the PV Lighthouse products, including the SunSolve.
That's right, yeah.
Maybe just one note on that. If anyone didn't get the email, if you want access to our subscriptions, please email me and I'll send you a link and I can add you to that. So if anyone didn't get the all school email, please contact me directly if need be.
Thanks, Phil.
Before we conclude, Rob, can I swap the display to my computer? Ali, remind me to advertise the spray event to the big audience. Can I change the HDMI to my computer for the? Yes. If no, I just use words. So this year is a big celebration for spray. Thanks, Keith, for bringing such big audience to us.
Thank you.